In this video, we're going to start talking a little bit more about the concept of static class members. Now, throughout these live lessons videos, we've taken a look at many different examples, and in some of those examples, we had simply a main method that performed some tasks within the body of main, and in other examples, we had two classes, one which contained a main method, and within that main method, we created objects of a second class and interacted with those objects. Now, when we were interacting with objects, we would typically access properties on those objects or invoke methods on those objects. And in both cases, using those properties or calling those methods depended on data within the specific objects of the classes that we were interacting with. So for example, back in lesson 4, when we were talking about the account class, when we created an object of that class, it contained a name of the account holder and a balance for that account holder, and that was specific to that one object of class account. If we then interacted with a separate object of class account accessing that name and that balance, that would be dependent on the data in a physically separate object, and each individual object had its own copy of those so-called instance pieces of data, instance variables or instance properties. Now, there are also these things called static class members, both methods and then also variables and properties. And these are not associated with or dependent on specific objects of a class. So, for example, in a main method, when we call console.writeLine, console is a class, WriteLine is a static method of that class, and the WriteLine method performs a task for us that is not dependent on a console object. And because it's not associated with a specific object, we make it a static method of the class, and that allows us to invoke the method directly through the class's name. So all static methods of classes are invoked by using the class name, a dot, the method name, and then in parentheses whatever arguments are required by that method. Now, when you're looking at online documentation, and let me switch over to my web browser for a moment here, this is the online documentation for the system namespaces console class, and here we have various versions of the WriteLine method. When you're looking at the online documentation for the .NET framework, you'll see that there are these icons over in the left-hand column here that help you identify those methods, properties, variables, whatever you happen to be looking at in the online documentation. Now, this little pink icon to the left here indicates a public member of the class, and the large yellow capital S indicates a static member of the class. Anytime you see a public static member of a class, you can call or use that member of the class directly through the class's name. So all of these different versions of WriteLine are capable of being called via the console class name and a dot operator. And similarly, if there are properties that are static, you can access those as well. So for example, if I go back to the properties of class console, there's a whole bunch of properties here, and you'll notice for those properties that they all have this capital S indicating that they are static properties of the class. So for example, the in property represents the so-called standard input stream, and that's where the keystrokes that you type into a program are being read from at the command line. And similarly, if I scroll down here, you'll see the out property, which represents the standard output stream. And when you use console.writeLine in order to display text in the command line, console.out is the object that's actually doing the output underneath the hood of the WriteLine method. So let me switch back over to my PowerPoint slide here. And in addition to static methods, which don't depend on a specific object of the class that they belong to, you can also have static properties and variables as well. The syntax for accessing those is always going to be the name of the class, followed by a dot, and the variable name, or the name of the class, a dot, and the property name. And in the vast majority of cases, it's going to be a property name that you access as opposed to a variable name. The reason for that is it's considered good practice in .NET and in C# in particular to protect every piece of data within a class, whether it's an instance variable or a static variable, which we also call a class variable because it's associated with the class. Protect all of those variables with corresponding properties, which allow you to define set and get accessors and do things like validation when you're manipulating those pieces of data. Now, in the case of class math, which we're going to be using a little bit in this lesson, there are a couple of static properties that are built into the class, one of which is the math constant pi, and you see the syntax for that at the bottom of the slide here. And again, because pi is a piece of data that is well defined, we don't need to have multiple copies of pi. It's always going to be the same value. So static variables are sometimes used to share data amongst objects of a class, but they're also commonly used for constant information where you only need one copy of a piece of data.